Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Stephanie Gregson, Chief Deputy Superintendent of Public Instruction. On behalf of State Superintendent Tony Thurman, I would like to welcome you to this webinar on implementing world languages instruction in a distance learning environment. As district schools and families continue to shift to distance learning models, the California Department of Education is committed to supporting this transition. In particular, CDE places a high priority on helping educators to deliver high-quality instruction to each and every student. Our webinar today, hosted by Shanine Coates, the Director of the Curriculum Frameworks and Instructional Resources Division, will provide guidance on ways to successfully teach a world language from a distance. Our partner in facilitating this webinar is Nicole Natives, who will share ideas for teaching the California 2019 World Languages Standards in a distance learning format. We are honored to have Nicole with us today. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I would like to remind you to visit the CDE's COVID-19 website for information and ongoing updates. We hope everyone is staying safe and healthy and learned something new today. Now I'll turn it over to Shanine.
Thank you, Dr. Gregson. Welcome to today's webinar. As Dr. Gregson mentioned, CDE is committed to supporting high-quality instruction that meets the needs of each and every student. We recognize that the teacher's role and the instruction they provide is essential for students to learn a language. In today's webinar, we will hear from Nicole Natives, Program Specialist for Instructional Technology and World Languages, National Board Certified Teacher, and former Chair of the World Languages Subcommittee of the Instructional Quality Commission. We are excited that Ms. Natives is available to share ideas for engaging students of world languages. She will share tools and resources that teachers can use in the context of distance learning to ensure students continue to develop and strengthen their language acquisition. During the webinar, you will be able to enter any questions you have in the Zoom Q&A window. We will respond to as many questions as our time today will allow. If we cannot immediately answer your questions, we will respond following the meeting. Your questions also help us in the continual development of our FAQs. We're ready for Nicole Natives to begin her presentation. Nicole?
Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody. I am so thrilled and honored to be here today to share some thoughts and ideas regarding how we can really go the distance with world languages and still continue to focus on proficiency-oriented distance learning. Excuse me. In our work today, we are going to be looking at several facets of designing instruction for distance learning, including providing practice and feedback for learners and the assessment of student performance across the modes of communication. This is a fast-paced session, but there is no expectation that everything we are doing today is new to all of you. There is a lot of expertise here watching with us today, and there's no need to remember everything. The slides, the recording of this video, and additional resources will be posted by the California Department of Education. Sometimes I will mention specific technology tools, but because of limitations that make it challenging to switch the screens during a Zoom webinar, and because the focus of today's program is not a how-to on technology, we won't be seeing those tools live today. However, I am making sure that you will have plenty of resources to support you in selecting and using the tools that are going to be the best fit for your learners in the context of really building their proficiency in world languages and the cultures of those who speak those languages. Although we cannot in 1 hour explore all the facets of world language instruction in online and blended settings, we will spend a little time on several key factors and components today. First of all, we'll take a look at using the platform that you have available to you and really how to leverage that. We'll also spend a bit of time talking about building community, as well as designing standards-aligned learning experiences, providing varied practice across the modes of communication, designing, or rather supplying appropriate feedback that helps learners know where they are in relationship to the learning targets and what their next steps are in their learning journey. We'll also look at designing assessments that provide the information that both students and teachers need regarding the student's progress or achievement of the learning targets. And we'll even spend a little bit of time talking about the importance of providing a clear path for learners to get help when needed. So let's get started with our platforms. A platform for your online learning allows you to centralize and organize your lessons, your resources, your practice, and your assessment. Students know where the platform is, how to access it, how it's organized, when to expect new content and information, and how to use the tools of the platform to get help. Platforms might include Google Classroom, Seesaw, Schoology, Edmodo, or even paid platforms such as Canvas. It is really important to know and understand what tools are available in your platform and then leverage those tools so that learners have the opportunity to have their voices heard in the community and to contribute in the community. You want to look for question options or discussion board type activities that your learners can participate in, or maybe consider whether or not the platform provides the opportunity to give learners permission to contribute to the community by posting messages and resources for the whole class. And if needed, you'll want to know how to use the features of your tool to mute those students who need more time and support to make appropriate choices in dynamic online platforms and communities. Leveraging features of your platform also includes looking for opportunities to differentiate which content and resources each learner receives based on their individual needs. As you work with your platform, you'll want to also consider what is best delivered and organized in your platform asynchronously versus synchronously. We don't have very much control over how much access students have to devices right now, actually. We also don't have much control over when in the day students have access to their devices. So teachers who choose to deliver new instruction synchronously must also be prepared to provide some way for learners to make up that instruction, to still learn that content in a way that is accessible to them if they missed that online live meeting. Synchronous instruction may be best suited for check-ins and opportunities for students to get additional support, as well as to practice interpersonal communication, although we will hear about a tool later that can help simulate an interpersonal task in an asynchronous setting. We'll come back to the synchronous and asynchronous discussion a little bit later as well. Let's move towards that really important concept of building and sustaining community. One of the reasons the shift to distance learning that happened this spring, and it happened very abruptly with none of us being anticipating it or being prepared for it, one of the main reasons that helped it be as successful as it was across all of our learning agencies and districts and schools was because teachers had already had several months this school year during which they had really built and fostered positive, respectful, and valued classroom communities. So as we look forward to this next year, which has some uncertainty regarding how we will return to school in the fall, building and maintaining community are going to be of critical importance, and it will be really crucial to leverage your platform in order to bring in your students' voices, their hopes, their challenges, their concerns, their questions, their interests, right? And so if needed, if the tool that is serving as your platform doesn't have as many ways to do this as you would like, it may be needed to branch out to other tools that will allow your students to share and reply to each other within the community, as well as tools that allow learners to only share kind of privately with you or even anonymously with you. So for threaded or collaborative options where the students can not only post their feelings and so on, but also have their posts be seen by others and replied to by others, you might consider tools such as Padlet or Dot Storming or Flipgrid, or even the question feature in Google Classroom with the replies turned on. If you're looking for individual or anonymous options where what the student has to share or post is private, you can consider, for example, the social emotional learning template slides offered by Pear Deck, Seesaw, Mentimeter, Poll Everywhere, Google Forms, or again, the question feature in Google Classroom, but this time with the replies turned off. A nice bonus is that all of these tools I've mentioned can also be used later for practice activities. So once they've learned how to use these tools when we're addressing our students' social emotional needs and building our community and really bringing together that sense of a dynamic online respectful community, they'll know how to use them later when they come back for practice opportunities. You will see links to all of these tools and more later in today's session. And when this slide deck is shared, additional support resources will be included to help you select and use the best tools. So again, please don't worry about trying to remember all of those and so on, because support will be provided for you. Successful online learning experiences share several components, and we're going to really hone in on the world language pieces of this today, but they are standards aligned and focused on essential learning targets. In addition, instruction, practice, and assessment reflect the practices called out in the new draft World Languages Framework. These online learning experiences build from and value previous knowledge or life experience, and they are designed for success, meaning that there are several features that will really help ensure that each learner is getting what they need in order to continue to make forward progress with the rigorous academic content of our curriculum. They include short segments or chunks. They include support for all learners, such as guides and resources to support learners throughout the instruction and practice sequence, including built-in checks for understanding. And again, as mentioned earlier, these online learning experiences can be synchronous, meaning all the students are in this live setting with you at once, kind of like I am now in this Zoom webinar, or asynchronous, meaning that you post something and students can access it anytime the next time they have their devices handy. Given the varied nature and in some cases limitations of students' access to technology, many teachers prefer to provide new instructional content, new lessons asynchronously so that their learners can view and review them when they are able to and as often as needed. As I said earlier, synchronous opportunities can be particularly good for check-ins such as office hours and interpersonal practice and assessment. Often teachers will have learners make appointments in order to have a synchronous time to engage in interpersonal communication. So we want to be sure that as we are continuing to work in this either blended or fully online model when we come back to school in the fall, that our learning experiences are still tightly aligned and connected with our 2019 World Languages Standards. We have three main or large standards, each of which has several substandards or elements. Our three standards are communication, cultures, and connections. Today, we will spend quite a bit of time with the first three substandards of the communication standard, which are interpersonal communication, interpretive communication, and presentational communication. We will also touch on at different points this hour, the importance of the culture standard, looking at culturally appropriate interaction and the interrelationship of cultural products, practices, and perspectives. The connection standard really digs into the fact that through well-designed language learning opportunities, students also have the opportunity to connect with other disciplines through the target language and to begin to recognize and understand diverse perspectives and distinctive viewpoints that are only available to speakers of the target language. As world language educators, our world language standards, which were collaboratively developed with language teachers, some of whom I noticed in the participant list today, call on us to implement several instructional shifts, whether learning is occurring in a face-to-face setting or an online environment. While these shifts have been part of our standards since they were adopted in 2019, they are still, or perhaps even more important now as we plan for a return to some kind of blended or online distance learning in the fall. Just a few of these shifts, there are 15 of them, but just a few of them that are called out in our standards include that students learn to use the target language rather than master discrete grammatical concepts in isolation. Teachers use backwards design to craft culturally rich, learner-centered learning experiences, focusing on the modes of communication. And there is extensive use of thematic approaches and authentic resources. These are all things that we are called upon as educators and practitioners in world language education to continue to ensure that they are part of the backbone of our learning experiences that we are providing, whether they are synchronous or asynchronous, however we are making those available. In addition to our standards, we also will want to consult the Draft World Languages Framework. A framework serves as the guidebook for teachers, administrators, students, families, and community members to more deeply understand the standards of a content area and receive guidance in the development of courses, the selection of instructional materials, lesson design, assessment, professional learning, and more. The Draft World Languages Framework has 14 chapters, but of particular interest to most teachers are those that are listed here and on the next slide. Chapter 5, Implementing High-Quality World Languages Instruction. Chapter 6, Teaching the Communication Standards. Chapter 7, Teaching the Culture Standards. Chapter 8, Teaching the Connection Standards. Chapter 9, The Proficiency Ranges in the World Languages Standards. And Chapter 10, Assessing the Learning of World Languages. And you'll see that in today's session, we're going to be touching on the themes that are really fleshed out and with examples and vignettes provided in these chapters that I have listed. You can access the full framework, including these chapters, online at the website that's provided on this slide. As educators, we use our standards along with our framework, and in the case of world languages, another document that are called the can-do statements, and they're provided by the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages. You'll hear me say ACTFL throughout the presentation, and the National Council of State Supervisors of Foreign Language. So those standards, the framework, and the can-do statements come together to help us design and deliver instruction that will allow each learner to interpret and use the target language for a variety of purposes beyond the classroom. So we're going to be diving more specifically into some lesson design that is aligned to our standards and to the practices called out in our framework, with special consideration for implementing lessons in a distance learning model. However, before we do so, it's important to note that the draft framework, the California Department of Education and Instructional Quality Commission will recommend that the State Board of Education adopt the World Languages Framework at their next meeting on July 8 and 9. So for this next segment of the presentation, we're going to be using portions of this template, which is provided by ACTFL, the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages. This will help us provide some structure to our conversation around the design of online or blended world language learning experiences. And the full template is available for download at the site that is linked on the bottom of this slide. And again, you will have access to this slide deck, so every link in it will be available to you. So to start with, we'll be talking a little bit about performance targets, as well as the importance of the essential question or theme, and those can-do statements that I referred to a moment ago across the modes of communication. And in this next session, there's also there's also a structure to it that I want to share with you before we start. We're going to use a format that calls out both what has not changed because of our shift to distance learning and what new considerations and opportunities emerged because of distance learning. So just for this next segment, we're going to be doing both of those things as we work through this template. That's going to kind of guide us through the lesson design process specifically for world languages. So as we look at the importance of performance targets and essential questions, some of the things that haven't changed include that lesson content and the practice activities and assessments are guided by pre-established performance targets for what learners should be able to do cumulatively at the end of that series of lessons. for each mode. And they are also guided, these learning experiences are also guided by essential questions that really invite inquiry by our learners so that they grow not only an understanding of words or maybe in phrases or even structures, but also a deeper sense of an understanding of the cultures of the people who speak these languages. In addition, another facet that hasn't changed is that performance targets are going to guide those short and long-term lesson planning because they are kind of that cumulative objective at the end of a series of lessons. And they also guide assessment. And they provide a means to both measure progress and to know when and how to implement scaffolds that our learners are showing us that they need. An additional facet that has not changed is that our lessons are going to continue to be standards aligned. But there are some new considerations in light of distance learning when it comes to the selection of particularly essential questions. Classes whose learners are functioning at the intermediate range or higher may benefit from essential questions that explore facets of and responses to the current situation. There are a lot of amazing authentic resources right now across all languages related to the pandemic. However, I would ask that you use this with caution because for some learners, as tempting as these amazing authentic resources are and how rich they are and how much potential we see in them, we don't know everything that's happening in our learners' life, and this current topic may be triggering for some learners. When it comes to our discrete kind of daily lesson objectives, one of the things that hasn't changed is that clearly defined and shared learning targets actually help learners put the pieces of the puzzle together as they progress through their learning journey in any content area. So we want to define our learning targets and we want to share them with our learners so that they're not a secret. The selected can-do statements are going to be appropriate for the current proficiency range of the learners and as stepping stones for the range that they are aiming towards. And we will be talking more about proficiency ranges a little bit later. The can-do statements also continue to be a logical reflection of those performance targets you already selected for what students will be able to demonstrate after the end of a series of lessons. The can-do statements inform the content of those discrete lessons. They also inform the selection and design of practice activities and the eventual assessment tasks. Can-do statements continue to be communicated to learners who use them to gauge their own progress and set goals. And ACTFL, the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages, makes sample can-do statements available online, and a link to those will be included with the resources that will accompany this video and slide deck. For new considerations in light of distance learning, as we look at how our students aren't with us in the classroom right now, and we're trying to communicate not only our goals and our objectives for them, but also make sure we answer their questions and deliver learning experiences with new instructional content and practice and so on, it's even more important perhaps to really be sure that our learners know and understand the can-do statements that are the focus of the lesson and what success in those statements will look like. It is also particularly helpful to not only tell the learners what the can-do statement is, but what the path will be for how learners will get from where they are today to achievement of that can-do statement. For example, we're going to have 3 lessons on the following topics. You will be able to practice in the following ways, and here's how you're going to be assessed. So as we work further down this lesson design template, we're going to move now towards the area of gaining their attention and activating prior knowledge to set up the learners for a successful learning experience, and then providing that language input for the new language content that we want to share with them in our lessons. And how do we get the learners to then perform for us and in practice and assessment settings so that we know how they're doing, so that they know how they're doing with the new structures, the new language that is part of this lesson. So one of the things that hasn't changed is that this phase remains critical because it actually sets the stage for learning by readying the neural synapses in the brain to take in new information, store and organize that information, and make connections with previous knowledge and their own life experiences so that they actually can go back into their schema in their minds and call upon that information later as needed. So it's tempting sometimes to skip this phase of kind of setting them up for the new lesson, but it actually remains just as critical as ever. But there are some new considerations and opportunities in light of distance learning. For example, one of the considerations is that it might be even more important now to use this phase to provide learners with an opportunity to reconnect with you, reconnect with each other, right, in order to maintain that sense of community and belonging and involvement in something other than an isolated learning experience of them by themselves in front of a computer screen. It is also critically important now that we don't have the opportunity to have them in our classes with us every day to revisit and practice those previously learned foundational skills that are going to lay the groundwork for the new learning target that they're about to dive into. It's interesting to note as an opportunity that some learners might actually respond more readily to tasks in this digital space. Some are actually more willing to ask questions because they have some channels available where they don't have to ask that question in front of everybody. And some learners might be more willing to try some of these performance and practice tasks than they were perhaps in our in-classroom settings. Conversely, we also may have some students who are reluctant to do so compared to how they participated in an in-person brick and mortar setting. But another interesting opportunity that avails itself right now because of distance learning is, since we as educators are all putting everything out there for our learners, we have it organized in our platform, our students know how to navigate the platform and get to things, it means that perhaps more than before, students have both the ability and the time to make observation, to observe what their previous learning was, to reflect on it, to confirm what they already know, to revisit past lessons. This gift of time and access is something that they didn't always feel in a traditional classroom setting where the pace is directly controlled by the instructor in the room on the day of the lesson. There are several strategies available that we might use to gain attention. And here's another case where I'm going to share some tools, and there will be, these links will be available to you so that you can explore them to make the best choices for you. And remember, in this phase, we're looking for tools that actually can be harnessed to kind of pull back in students' previous knowledge that is going to lay a foundation for the new lesson, as well as other learning experiences that will kind of ready their brain for the kinds of learning experiences that are coming next. Some of these tools include brainstorming activities, right, where they can, even novice learners can brainstorm a list of words, and they can use tools such as Lucidchart, which is kind of like a graphic organizer and flowchart creator, Padlet, which is like an online bulletin board where students can respond by typing, audio recording, video recording, or even drawing on a phone, tablet, computer, or Chromebook. Mentimeter has many, many options, but one that's particularly good for the gaining attention phase is the word cloud option. So you put up a question and students type in a single word or maybe up to 3 words as a response, and it automatically creates a word cloud based on all the responses that have been contributed. And dot storming, which is kind of like Padlet in that it's a blank board where students can post text or images. But the students can also like each other's texts and comment on it, or they can vote things up. So it's, again, kind of a threaded type of tool that can be used in a community, both for community building as well as for practice, and in this case, the gaining attention phase. You also might consider some gamified activities that are going to draw out some specific previously learned vocabulary or previously learned structures that the students are going to need for this next lesson, such as quizzes, GymKit, Kahoot, Quizlet Live, Fluent Key Live, which is a video tool, but it actually has a live version that makes it sort of like a game where as the video plays, it'll stop, it'll ask questions, and students can earn points. And it does have a way to do this asynchronously, so it can happen where students do it at any time, not just at the live time that might be designated. An additional interesting way to gain attention and ready learners for the new content is actually to build in personal narrative activities that allow learners to use the language they have to share personal stories and experiences on topics that will set the stage for their learning. And the degree to which they do this successfully does depend on their proficiency range with the target language. But for novice learners, it can be as simple as listing or sorting items based on their personal experiences, such as you can put just a 2-column chart on a Google slide and put it in the background of the slide so the students can't move it. And then you can have words at the bottom that are text boxes, and the students can drag those words into one of the 2 columns based on their preferences or whether or not they have done that thing or seen that thing. And in that way, those words that are going to be crucial, necessary knowledge that they need to have at the ready for their new lesson are going to be reactivated by doing this simple sorting activity. So a link will show you exactly what I was talking about in terms of a very simple Google slide template with text boxes that the students can drag. And then finally, we don't want to neglect the possibility of using authentic resources as an attention-gaining tool to start our lessons. Poems, songs, ads, infographics, and other types of authentic resources that include the needed foundational language for the new lesson can be very powerful and incredibly engaging for our learners. And you can kind of have a bonus with these authentic resources if you're able to find authentic resources that also include the new content of the upcoming lesson so that you can reuse that same resource later during or after the lesson. The first time you present it to them in an activity, the students are going to do an activity focusing on the already known vocabulary or the already known language structures. The second time they see it later in the lesson, they will be focusing on the new language or structures that they have been practicing and acquiring as a result of the learning experiences that you have designed. Once we've gained their attention and really readied them for the new lesson, it's time to provide input in the target language. And there are several factors that have not changed, even though our method of delivery may have changed. One is that the new content, this input, is rooted in developing students' understanding of the relationship between cultural products, practices, and perspectives. And the input is provided in the target language. If we lead with culture, language will follow. Language and culture do not exist in isolation of each other. Every language in the world is absolutely determined. The way it's put together, the reason why the word order is different, all of those things are culturally dependent. So we really want to be sure that lessons continue to be rooted in culture and that input is provided in the target language rather than explained in English, which actually will make it harder for our learners to themselves use the target language. This input is going to be modeled and contextualized in an authentic cultural context and aligned to our standards. And it's purposefully and precisely designed to ensure achievement of the learning targets. Over time, lessons build on each other and provide opportunities for learners to acquire and use knowledge that spans the depth and breadth of our standards in a way that is appropriate for their range of proficiency. And I would add here as well that well-designed input, as you'll hear me say a couple more times later, includes built-in checks for understanding with a way for the students to know whether or not they are getting it. And we'll come back to that a little bit as well. So there are some new considerations and opportunities in light of distance learning. One of the things we have to be thoughtful of is there have been some negative effects for some of our learners when we went to this shift to distance learning. And so we need to do everything we can in our lesson design to mitigate the negative impacts from this year's interruptions and changes and from inequities in student circumstances. We want to ensure that learning continues, even if we have to limit the number of learning targets, for example, as we look at how we will return to school in the fall. Doing so should not ultimately exacerbate inequities. Instead, we will want to be sure to be really strategic in our selection of the most high-yield learning targets combined with thoughtful lesson design. And this will go far to help learners maintain their current rate of progress, especially if we are viewing progress in realistic terms, guided by what we know about learners' movement on the proficiency continuum. It's also important to remember that students are viewing lessons on their time. So it's your lessons, but they're viewing the lessons on their own time. And so it may be even more important to build in strategies for them to gauge their comprehension because they can't just raise their hand and tell you they have a question. They also may not have consistent access to technology, so shorter segments of input with a window of time to watch that segment and respond to it might be helpful to our learners. And it might actually take longer for students to complete lessons. This actually depends a lot on the learner, but because the learners are viewing the lessons on their own time, this also gives them the opportunity to make a choice that maybe wasn't as accessible to them in a face-to-face classroom. They can stop the lesson anytime they need to, not just because they need to walk away from it or someone else needs the computer, but maybe they want to take notes. Maybe they want to review a segment and watch it again. That wasn't something you could necessarily do as easily in the classroom, but the learners have the opportunity to rewind and watch as much as they need to or want to. And so as we look at those things combined, some students might actually spend longer getting through a lesson than they would have if they were in a classroom with us. And so it's really important to consider that when you're designing your chunks. What ends up being recorded as a 15-minute chunk may not, in fact, only take 15 minutes for your learners. But there are also opportunities. As I alluded to before, students can now review and revisit lessons as often as needed if they have consistent access to technology. And there are several technology tools that exist that can be leveraged to design impactful online instruction with new material. For example, well-designed Google Slides or PowerPoint slides or Keynote on a Mac can be leveraged. And there's even tools that you can combine with Google Slides or combine with PowerPoint that are called interactive slide decks. Pear Deck is one such tool and Nearpod is another. Pear Deck just added 2 new features, actually, one of which came after I created the slide deck. They now have a really easy add audio feature so that you can provide your learners some audio support to go with the visual and text input. There's just a simple button for you to record on each slide, and they have a little play button on each slide when they receive it. And they also added an individual feedback feature for each of those interactive slides, which you can use as checks for understanding. This is also the tool that I mentioned has social emotional template slides. You can actually now not just see what each student says in response, but you will now be able to actually click on something to give each individual student feedback as needed or ask a follow-up question. Nearpod is a very similar tool to Pear Deck. Other presentation tools, depending on your style and what works for you, because ultimately if it doesn't work for you, you're not going to use it, include Prezi and a new tool called Prezi Video. So the links that you're going to get later will actually include a link to a YouTube channel, which includes video live trainings with live demos of several of these tools. Another tool that you might use is something like Screencastify or Screencast-O-Matic or any other screen recorder that will allow you to talk as you present the material that you've prepared on your slides. You can also use it to record demos of how to use a new website that your students are going to use for a particular activity and so on. It's an extension for Google Chrome, but there are several other screen recording tools available as well. But it's critical to remember that the magic is never, ever, ever in the tool. None of these tools are magical. It's always about what the teachers and learners do with the technology. That's what makes the learning happen, not the tool. The tool is just there as a shell for you. It is just there as a delivery mode to help you get information out, but the real learning and the power is going to come from you. So regardless of the tool used, here are some features of a well-designed video lesson. Since language is rooted in culture, learners' ultimate proficiency depends on culturally contextualized and comprehensible input. And the comprehensibility does not come from translating in English. Instead, it comes from careful selection of the appropriate learning targets and designing learning experiences precisely to achieve those targets. Starting with building on previous knowledge and including some other supports that I'm about to share with you. I had mentioned this earlier, but it's so critically important. Take a longer lesson and find the natural breaks and break that into short chunks. Depending on the age of your learners, 5 to 15 minutes is ideal. And it does 2 things. Number one, it supports the reality of students' access to technology, which may not allow them to have the device handy for an extended period of time. But more importantly, it also supports learning because these short chunks support what's known as primacy and recency. What research tells us about the brain is when a presentation is happening, like this one here, the participants or the viewers or the learners are most likely to learn and retain the first thing that was said, that's the primacy part, and the last thing that was said, That's the recency part. In a long session like this one, that means there's a whole lot of content in the middle that's going to go by the wayside for most people. That's again why I said it's important for you to access the video later so you can go back to the things that are important to you. If you break your lessons into chunks, everything is either the first or the last thing you said, and you really reduce the amount of learning lost to that segment in the middle that just kind of goes into the ether. You also want to do what Todd Rose calls designing for the edges. He has a TED Talk called The Myth of Average. And essentially what he says is there's no average learner, really. So trying to design for the average student actually automatically leaves virtually everybody out without the support they need to be successful and to reach the full height of their potential. So instead, you'll want to ensure that instructional videos include support that designs for all the edges of your learners. Visuals to support oral and printed texts, and simple, clear slides. In addition, content should first draw on previous knowledge and life experience, and then provide multiple contextualized models or examples of the new language, as well as metacognition when appropriate, where the teacher actually kind of talks through their thinking. It is also very important, as I keep saying, to build in checks for understanding, but also be sure to include sample responses throughout the video so that students know if they got it, right? And they can either continue the lesson in confidence or go back and review the information and content some more before continuing. Finally, especially when we're doing this online learning and they can't see you every day or just quickly chat with you to find out what they need to know, you might want to ensure that your video lessons include information on where and how students can get help if needed. So we've gone through this lesson sequence of selecting our performance targets for the end of several lessons and our learning targets, and then gaining their attention and providing input. And now we want the learners to start practicing and performing these new language and cultural skills, and we want to make sure that they receive feedback for that work. So what hasn't changed is that our learners still need multiple opportunities to practice in ways that are aligned with the learning targets. And it is critical that to the greatest extent possible, practice activities focus more on communication than on grammatical accuracy. A lot can still be understood even if there is a random grammatical error. Students benefit from actionable feedback that not only tells them what they did well, but provides useful information about the student's next steps. And we're going to address feedback as a separate section in a little bit. So some new considerations in light of distance learning include that it's really important, given the differences in the way students might access their technology and the time that they have or don't have, that we provide multiple opportunities to practice and multiple ways to practice, and that we consider providing a window of time for learners to both view lessons and to complete and submit practice activities, rather than multiple specific and inflexible due dates. However, there are also quite a few opportunities due to distance learning as well. For example, there's a wide range of tools, many of which are free, that are available for learners to use to practice across the modes of communication. Just be strategic in your selection of the tools, because it's never about the tool and always about the learning and how the tool truly supports achievement of the learning targets. And when you design your practice activities, it's a good idea to give some thought to how the learners might get feedback, because it doesn't all have to come from you. And we will talk about this a little bit later. So the end of our template for designing learning experiences includes the idea of closure, as well as enhancing retention and transfer. And we're going to focus more on the enhancing of retention and transfer right now. And it's really important to remember that perhaps more than any other subject, world language study depends and builds on previous content. You don't ever get to forget the things that you learned in your first language classes. You need all of that as you continue building your language proficiency. Therefore, retention and transfer are actually critical to our work. And we want to design in some of the ways that I shared a little bit ago, so that we facilitate students' ability to retain and keep that information and transfer it when needed as they take on new lessons that are going to draw upon that content. and even transfer it to other content areas. A lot of the work we do, for example, supports students' literacy across the board. But we also need to consider that solid lesson design is going to be critical to their retention and transfer. But depending on the platforms that you're using, students might be more likely to be able to access the course resources from all of these lessons as needed as they move forward into subsequent courses of study in the language. You're all doing so much work right now, building and storing and sharing and organizing all this content. It's going to be there for your learners going forward. So this actually is an opportunity that we are now seeing as a result of our shift to distance learning. So we're going to dive even more deeply into practice because this is a really key area of need in world languages. And I think it's an area that felt even more complicated in some ways when we shifted to distance learning. So the key features of high leverage practice opportunities in world languages include that every single practice activity is strategically and purposefully designed specifically to be aligned to the learning targets that are the objective of the lesson and therefore the assessment of those learning targets. And to the greatest extent possible, the focus is always on communication. The opportunities to practice are multiple and varied, and they will eventually span the depth and breadth of the standards for that range of proficiency. And students will receive actionable feedback. So these are the key features of that whole opportunity students will have to practice with each lesson if we're going to maximize the benefit of the practice activities that the learners are doing. And before we talk about designing the practice activities in each mode of communication, it's important to understand proficiency ranges and stages. Each of our California World Languages standards of communication, culture, and connections describes targeted outcomes by using proficiency ranges: novice, intermediate, advanced, and superior. The term proficiency describes what learners can do in the language consistently, accurately, and spontaneously in authentic language use situations outside of class without the aid of their teacher or notes or instructional materials. That's what true proficiency is. For learners who begin their study of language in middle or high school and continue studying that same language for 4 to 6 years and are not heritage learners of the language, the performance target upon graduation from high school ranges from intermediate low to intermediate high, depending on the mode of communication: interpretive mode, interpersonal mode, or presentational mode, and depending on the language studied. It's important to know that students do not move in a linear way up or across the proficiency scale. They spend multiple years in each range and often progress more quickly in some modes of communication than others. Language learners who are operating in the novice range consistently, accurately, and spontaneously use and understand memorized words and phrases on very familiar topics, daily topics related to the self. So this is different from being able to actually truly put sentences together. The sentences they use work because they have memorized them. If they try to break them apart and recombine them, that's where you start all of a sudden to see the struggles and you realize they're not intermediate, they're novice. Language learners operating in the intermediate range, on the other hand, consistently, accurately, and spontaneously use and understand sentence-level language. And for those languages with verb tenses, that's primarily in the present and past tenses on topics related to the self and the immediate environment, as well as topics of personal interest. These learners can start, maintain, and close a conversation on topics with which they are familiar and in situations without complications. So with that understanding, we're going to start diving into each mode of communication as defined by our standards. Interpretive communication occurs when students demonstrate understanding, interpret and analyze what is heard, read, or viewed on a variety of topics from authentic texts. It is one-way communication, with the language user receiving content through images, text, audio, or video, but with no opportunity to actively negotiate meaning with the writer, speaker, or producer. For example, you aren't able to interact with me right now. You're depending on my design of this presentation in order to understand and interpret the messages that I'm conveying. It's important to note that interpretation isn't just comprehension and it isn't just translation. Interpretation goes beyond that. It implies the ability to read or listen or view between the lines, including understanding from within a cultural mindset or perspective, usually one that is different from that or those of the learner. One is engaging in interpretive communication when they are reading website stories or articles, listening to speeches, messages, or songs, or viewing video clips or live presentations of authentic materials in the target language. The next mode of communication we'll talk about a little bit is interpersonal communication. Interpersonal communication involves interacting with and negotiating meaning in a variety of real-world settings and for multiple purposes in spoken, signed, or written conversations. The characteristics of interpersonal communication are that it is spontaneous, two-way communication. And during that spontaneous two-way communication, the participants are constantly observing and monitoring each other to see if their meanings and intentions are actually being communicated correctly. And if needed, they make adjustments and clarifications when it becomes obvious that, in fact, they are not being understood the way they intended. So learners are engaging in interpersonal communication when they are speaking, signing, or listening in a conversation. And listening as part of being that active negotiator of two-way meaning with the other speaker. They also are engaging in interpersonal communication when they are reading and writing text messages or social media posts, because there isn't a lot of editing. We often just type and send. Again, this is spontaneous. It is not rehearsed. It's not memorized. It's not refined. It's not edited. It's not polished. It is unplanned, spontaneous, two-way communication between individuals. The third mode of communication is the presentational mode. The presentational mode of communication is where students present information, concepts, and ideas on a variety of topics and for multiple purposes in culturally appropriate ways. They might create messages or products to inform, explain, persuade, or narrate for a target culture audience. This is one-way communication. It's what I'm doing right now. And it's intended to facilitate interpretation, that deeper between the lines understanding by members of the other culture, where no direct opportunity exists to actually negotiate meaning and clarify if there's a misunderstanding. To ensure that the intended audience is successful in its interpretation of that message or that product, the presenter needs knowledge of both the audience's language and their culture. It happens with our learners when they are writing messages, articles, reports, websites, and so on with no opportunity to interact with those who will read them. It also happens when they tell a story, give a speech, or describe a poster to an audience, or when they visually represent by signing before an audience or presenting via video or PowerPoint. In all cases, these presentational communication events are edited, refined, practiced, and rehearsed. They are intended to be shared, ideally with an audience of target language speakers when possible. So if we're looking at developing practice opportunities in interpersonal, interpretive, and presentational modes of communication, and we're looking at distance learning, this is where we're probably going to need some technology to help us out a little bit. So I'm going to actually share some tools that might be helpful for specific modes of communication. It's really important to be selective and strategic. You don't need to use them all. This isn't Pokemon. You don't have to catch them all. You don't have to use them all. You want to only use the tools that provide the features that allow you and the learners to really benefit in the way that is intended and needed for that lesson at that moment. So one tool, starting with the interpretive mode of communication, that you might consider would be Edgy, which is an online tool that allows you put text and or images online for the learners, and they can actually annotate it with typing or audio recording or emojis. How well they do that and what those annotations can do and the power of them depends on the instructions you provide in the activity. If you decide to, you can also allow them to then see the document again, but the second time they'll see all of their classmates' annotations and they'll have the ability to reply to those so that they can continue engaging in conversation on that authentic resource. Kami is another tool that can be really powerful for interpretive communication in the reading mode because it allows you to put up a document, a PDF format, and again, the students can annotate it. They can highlight on it, they can draw on it, they can type on it, they can also add audio comments so that you can engage them in a number of kinds of activities that will be useful for them in the interpretive mode. For listening or viewing, you might consider tools such as Edpuzzle or FluentKey, both of which allow you to provide a video to learners that will stop and then ask learners a question before allowing the learners to continue to watch the video. The types of questions vary between the two tools. Edpuzzle is not specific to world languages. FluentKey actually is. I'd also consider using what's called the Integrated Performance Assessment Task Template, and that link will be shared with you in your resources. It provides a number of tasks you can do with authentic texts. You would never do all of them at once, and not all of them are appropriate for all proficiency ranges. However, it can give you a really great starting point to helping learners get beyond comprehension and into that interpretation of understanding between the lines. For interpersonal mode, a couple of tools that can be useful, especially if you're trying to facilitate interpersonal communication in an asynchronous setting, are extempore or go react. One of the nice features about extempore is that you can design an activity that limits how long the students have to listen to your side of the conversation, like your first opening question. They only get to listen to it one time, it's 15 seconds, and then they have to record a response within 15 seconds, and then it immediately moves to the next part of the conversation. So it tries to simulate that spontaneous conversation that can't really be prepared for or practiced or rehearsed or memorized. These are paid tools. Not all tools, unfortunately, are available for free, but it is one of the areas of difficulty for world languages sometimes is facilitating practice in the interpersonal mode. So I wanted to be sure to share both of these tools with you. American Sign Language teachers in particular are having great success with Go React, which is a tool that allows users to kind of respond via video. So that would include signing throughout a video that they are watching so that they can kind of interrupt the video and respond. In addition, for the presentational mode, this is probably one of the easiest modes to find tools to support you. It doesn't have to be complicated. Your students can type in Google Docs if you are doing written presentational communication. Similarly, they can use Google Draw and Google Slides, again, for written presentational communication. For speaking or video, or if you need to see them sign, for example, Adobe Spark has 3 tools. Adobe Spark Post, which is great for novice learners because it's very much like creating a flyer or social media post that is really focused on color and selective use of very few words combined with images in order to convey a message. There's also Adobe Spark Video, where students can combine in any combination they want video from their device, images, music, voiceover if needed, and text to create a video product. And Adobe Spark Page, which is an easy way for them to design a single page website. This is great for classes that are operating at the intermediate range of proficiency or higher and who've been studying a theme or context extensively and now need to synthesize that knowledge and create a product that demonstrates their synthesis and analysis of multiple perspectives on a topic. Flipgrid and Seesaw are both great for capturing presentational speaking or signing because they have easy, not glitchy video capture tools built in. Seesaw also could be used to capture writing as well because it has a wide range of ways that students can post content. If you're practicing with language structures, students are working on a new structure because they need it for this particular learning target, you might consider tools such as Google Forms, GoFormative, or again, Kami, which was presented on the previous slide. And for practice with vocabulary, you might consider tools such as Pear Deck, GoFormative, Google Forms, Kami, Quizzes, Quizlet, or Gymkit. Those were previously mentioned on previous slides as well, but you also have a matrix on this slide where I've made it a little bit easier for you to choose between formative assessment tools, focusing primarily on those that ask kind of quick, either short answer or multiple choice answer questions, but it'll help you make choices about which tool is the right tool to use with your learners at this time. Offering feedback to learners, I had mentioned earlier that you really want to plan for this. You really want your learners to receive feedback, and you can't do it all. So no matter how the students receive feedback, it should be actionable. It's nice to hear good job, but that doesn't actually tell the learners what specifically they did well, and it doesn't provide them with their next steps to achieve their learning target or goals. But instead of trying to handle all the feedback for every learner all the time on every practice activities, we can be strategic and draw on multiple ways that learners receive feedback if we plan for it. So they can receive feedback from their peers if you provide the rubric or some guiding questions aligned to the learning target for peers to consider when they're reviewing each other's work. So you might give them some work where they get review that way. They can also engage in their own self-assessment and reflection. Again, the guiding questions or the rubric will be helpful here. You can also use automatic feedback from tools that provide you a means to provide questions that can be automatically graded, and many of those tools actually allow you to add feedback for right answers versus wrong answers. And that feedback can include links to online resources so students can review and clear up misconceptions or strengthen their skills. It's really important to consider your distractors or your wrong answers carefully if you're using these multiple choice assessment tools, because you want every single wrong answer to tell you something useful about the learner's gap in knowledge or misconception or misunderstanding. That way you have data you can use to either individually or a whole class provide support, resources, and feedback. So once you've used up all of those with the automatic tools and so on, then you have teacher feedback either to the whole group based on things you're seeing across the whole class, or some feedback that you will provide just to individual learners. So we are coming near the end, and fortunately we are also very near the end of this session. Remember, this will be recorded in case you do have to jump out. But we are going to look a little bit more deeply at assessment and rubrics, and that will bring us to our close. So true assessment should allow learners to demonstrate their best performance of the learning targets. So it should be directly attached to the learning targets, and it should be communicative in focus. When learning targets were selected, ideally, so were the assessments. What students produce through their assessment tasks should be as authentic and realistic as possible, and their interpretive tasks should be based on authentic documents. One nice benefit of using authentic documents is that learners can sometimes learn from the materials used during their assessments, and I love it when my students tell me that they loved the assessment because they learned something while they were doing it. Assessment tasks should not feel like a gotcha or a trap. In fact, they shouldn't be a one-time activity that students have never experienced before. Tasks should follow logically from the practice activities that learners did leading up to this point. One natural benefit of this is that the students are much less likely to feel the urge to cheat if the assessment has been practiced via micro tasks that led to the assessment. The learners have already, through their practice with these micro tasks, demonstrated to themselves and you that they can do this. So they're a lot less likely to feel like they aren't ready for the assessment, and that is a huge factor in cheating. An integrated performance assessment is considered by some to be the hallmark for assessment in world languages. It is a whole nother workshop, 40-hour workshops even. But while performance assessment of a task that's in the modes of communication and is authentic and contextualized is always the goal, an integrated performance assessment goes a little bit further because it provides an even richer context and purpose for every single task in the assessment. And there is kind of a story that explains why the students are doing each task, and each task supports the student's achievement in the subsequent task. So a reading task will support the next task, which might be a listening task. And the two of them combined provide information that learners can use in a presentational, writing, or speaking, or signing task. And all of that then helps them when they have a spontaneous conversation on the topic that's also being assessed. In an online setting, this can still be done, often using the tools mentioned earlier in this session, but some thought will have to be given to ensuring the integrity of the students' responses. And when discussing assessments, consideration must also be given to evaluating the students' products. Many teachers find it helpful to use what's called a single point rubric. So I just want to put that out there for you as a possibility. Most rubrics, when you design them, attempt to clarify not only what it looks like to meet the standards in that center column for each criterion of the rubric, but also all the ways that the students might exceed those standards in strengths or not quite meet them as areas for growth. But invariably, once the students submit their assessment tasks, the teachers often find that the student responses included qualities that were not accounted for in the rubric, which makes it difficult to determine what marks the student should receive. A single point rubric only attempts to identify the characteristics of work that meet the standard, because that's usually pretty clear to both teachers and learners. The exceeding and not yet meeting columns of the rubric are left blank for teachers to provide notes specific to each learner's work. So today we covered a lot of ground around basic principles in designing online learning experiences that are aligned to our world languages standards and draft framework. Remember that you came in with a lot of experience today and a lot of expertise, so there was no expectation that everything was new, and there was definitely no expectation to remember it all. There will be resources provided, as I have said, that will actually also include more fleshed out resources for some of the technology tools that I have mentioned. I also want to leave you with this thought that you are all exactly where you needed to be when this started, and you are exactly where you need to be now. You are doing incredible, thoughtful work that is fostering your learners' linguistic and cultural proficiency, and that is no easy task in the best of settings and times. And when their learning went home, you worked harder. So I hope that today's session in some way, hopefully there's just one thing even, that supported and valued each and every one of you. And as I close, I want to let you know that if you have questions or want to get more information, you can contact the Department of Education at distancelearning@cde.ca.gov, or visit the webpage www.cde.ca.gov/ci/cr/dl/. There are also weekly email updates from the California Department of Education on COVID-19. So if you'd like to join that listserv and receive those updates, please send a blank email to join-covid19-update@mlist.cde.ca.gov. And thank you so much for joining us today.